Hey, everybody, welcome. I'm Tristan Rice. I sit on our continuous improvement staff development team here. Joining me today is Amanda Carlson-Phillips, Senior Vice President of on the performance team, focused on thought leadership, coming from a dietetic background as a registered dietitian, CSSD. Omi Iwasaki, also Senior Vice President in performance team, coming from a physical therapy background, and Brent Callaway, Performance Director of Pro Elite Sports, representing coaches and coaching. And today we've put together this panel to think specifically about managing the ability of an athlete to withstand the forces and the loads that are going to be placed on them during competition, during some sort of event, looking specifically at preventing injury. Today, talking and thinking most about that all too common hamstring pull, that hamstring strain, and thinking about things that we could do to mitigate exposure to that, right? What are things that we can do from a multidisciplinary standpoint? Thinking specifically from a recovery standpoint, from a nutrition standpoint, and from a coaching and programming standpoint, both before at different scales, what we can do to best prepare athletes to be able to do the things that they want to be able to do in the environments that they need to be able to do them. Right? We've all had athletes who have had hamstring pulls of one kind or another. And as we get into this conversation, really looking forward to this interdisciplinary sort of approach, looking not just at the X's and O's of programming, but the way that they really sort of all come together and integrate. And so, Omi, I want to come to you first before we dive into sort of the nuts and bolts of the management of injury prevention and building that into a program. When we think about hamstring injuries, right, a hamstring strain, from a recovery perspective, from a physical therapy perspective, what's actually happening? What is a hamstring strain? What's happening there?
Yeah, great question. So a muscle strain or a hamstring strain it refers to the muscle itself as a strain, where a sprain would be more associated with a joint. So what we're talking about strains. So a pulled muscle is probably the most commonly used term. It's basically an overstretching, overloading, and some micro tearing of a muscle, and it could happen in various grades, but that's basically what's happening. Results from fatigue, overloading, could be improper use or overloading from like a new activity, just say, or an unfamiliar activity. Common symptoms: pain, swelling, tightness, overall decreased just ability to move that area. It'll test typically weak and painful. And then a decrease in this range of motion, like I said, would most likely happen as well.
I think we've all been there, and we've certainly all had people in that sort of scenario, right? Like, and it just sort of nags at you, depending on the grade, right? Like, it just sort of it can sort of just nag at you, right? And sort of take days. And what's the recovery process look like? How long is it potentially going to be keeping somebody out?
Yeah, so on average, it's probably a 4 to 6 week period on a fairly mild strain. And then again, it could obviously be much more severe. As long as there's no rupture, then it could be, and you need reattachment for some reason, then of course it'll be a little bit more severe. But 4 to 6 weeks is a safe bet. It could be less, of course. Every injury is a little bit different, but that's about the average time frame that you'll see.
4 to 6 weeks, that could be a significant chunk of time for an athlete, right?
Absolutely.
You could lose the majority of a season just because of this one little thing, right? So seems well worth, was it an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Like, to look what we can do in the lead up to an event, into a performance, to a competition, of what we can do to sort of manage exposure to that, right? By preparing the athlete as best as possible to withstand those different positions and those different loads and those different time frames. And so now thinking about it, I appreciate that, Omi, getting us all on the same page there. So thinking then about a potential hypothetical athlete, right? Like, let's talk about Jamie, right? Like, and Jamie is getting ready for the NFL Combine. Jamie has a soccer game or a tournament, a track meet, a very long, trail run or ultra marathon or something like this. But Jamie's getting ready for this one singular event on one specific day, right? Like, not necessarily a competitive season, but in this case, for this conversation specifically, an event on a day, right? Like, so in thinking in the weeks to months prior to the events, right? Like prior to the combine, prior to the race, prior to whatever it is. What are some things that we can do at a macro scale to prevent the incidence of Jamie rupturing the hamstring when it comes to game day? And Brent, when I want to come and get your thoughts on this first from a strength coach, from potentially from a sport coach perspective. When someone first comes in, Jamie first steps into the gym, day one, week one, what are the things that you're going to be looking for, right? In terms of assessment, are there red flags that you're going to see that you're going to be able potentially to pull out of an assessment, and then let's carry that into, what we would then go ahead and do about it.
Yeah, sure. Good question. So, somebody comes into the facility that's getting ready for a big competition. Evaluation is the first place that we're always going to start, right? So what's the assessment of the athlete? And we do that in a number of ways. And I think, most good programs are going to take care of that situation, both from a movement quality standpoint, and then also from like a segmental movement standpoint. So what's the overall length of the posterior chain, the hamstrings, and how well do they move? And then looking at things like total hip arc, internal rotation versus external rotation of the femur, being able to have an understanding of the segmental ability of the athlete is important, specifically from a coaching standpoint, and then seeing them move, right? So if we have an athlete who is a multi-directional sport athlete or a runner in nature, how do they run? What's the structure of the positions that they get into? Are they an athlete who sits into a pelvic tilt position? So we've got tight hip flexors. We have lengthened hamstring situations, resting in extension of the lumbar spine. Whenever they sprint, what do their mechanics look like when they run? Do they contact the ground anterior to the center of mass, or is it closer to the center of mass? Do they stay in plantar flexion for a long time behind them? Looking at the stride cycle, the recovery mechanics of the athlete, the front side mechanics of the athlete when they're sprinting, and being able to tie that together. We also use a testing system called NordBoard from Bald Performance, where we can actually look at the eccentric strength of the hamstring, both bilaterally, and also any asymmetries that we could find in there. And we've got checkpoints for our athletes. So there are red flag moments. We kind of use a traffic light system where we've got a green is good to go, yellow there's a little bit of concern for these ranges of returns on the results. And then there's like our red zone athletes where we have some concerns. We may be starting an intervention program for them right away before we come back and test again. So evaluation and assessment is absolutely key. And then that helps to guide programming as we go into the future.
So there's a lot there, and I certainly appreciate you going into that. Omi, it sounds like you probably took a lot of the words out of your mouth, right? Thinking about movement quality and looking at, are you getting into a pelvic tilt and these sorts of things. From a PT standpoint, what are some gross characteristics that you're looking for, right? That might be red flags of somebody who might be prone to a hamstring pull through training or competition.
Yeah. So, obviously the red flags are important to see, and then we just need to understand why. The most important thing for me is to understand why. So it comes down to movement competency at the end of the day. And we kind of have our framework of position first. We need to understand basic positional prerequisites. Can they make these shapes, their ability to get into these shapes, and then we kind of have the pattern section next of the neuromuscular control or the ability to make those shapes or express those shapes. On maybe again, on an involved side or uninvolved side, we need to understand, are there painful movements? We need to understand, are there non-painful movements, and then again, are they dysfunctional or functional within kind of a normal range? Purely that's just a starting point. We just need to understand how they move. And again, is someone predisposed to something like this? You may see, maybe they don't come in with pain, but maybe the other performance-based testing caused some aches or pains or some, discomfort. We need to understand that. We need to understand their injury history as well, things that have happened to them in the past. Once you have an injury, you're more predisposed to have another further injury. So those are the things that we generally or grossly need to look at, but it just comes down to understanding why. They test weak or their range of motion isn't expressed as within a normal limit. we need to understand why. Is it that segment's fault, or that joint or that muscle's fault? Is it expressing that because there's an issue somewhere else that we need to look at? So we kind of like to assess the whole body and not just the relevant areas that maybe they've had pain before, but we need to understand the relationships or the interdependence, this muscular regional interdependence of understanding, what else is happening.
And so what I really like about that is that both of you guys sort of seem to talk about the same thing. Brent, you were talking about segmental movements, right? To look at movement quality. Omi, you said it was, I think, positional prerequisites, right? But looking at sort of the smallest scale, right? Like Brent, you're talking about hip arc, right? Of total internal external rotation. Because, and I imagine that the thought is that if you're not able, to make this smallest, to do this smallest sort of thing, if you're not able to internally rotate your hip, for example, that then, Omi, are you saying that then is going to affect your ability to make larger movements, put you in potentially compromised positions, which then may increase the likelihood that you're going to overstrain or overstretch the tissue?
Absolutely, because something will make up for that. So if you have a loss somewhere, or you have a series of losses that point to a specific directionality, simply put, can they make shapes to the right or can they make shapes to the left? I mean, just simply put. And again, is one side impacting the other, or is the side that we're going towards impacting that ability to make shapes? And maybe if this hip has a loss of internal rotation, just say, then what are the consequences of that? We're absolutely wonderful cheaters as human bodies, so we will find a way. So it kind of becomes a little bit predictable of, you see a loss there, then there's going to be some sort of compensatory action to make up for that loss, because your body still has to stay in motion. So, there's some predictable things that we'll look at. And then again, we also look at the connection of, we kind of call it our pillar, but our shoulder, torso, hips, they have a specific relationship in a specific directionality that they need to be able to make or express. And if that one area is limited, we also need to see what are some other correlating areas, because very rarely is it just one small thing, one hip that doesn't internally rotate. It's probably going to be a collection of things, either on the same side or the opposite side of the body, that is predisposing them to demonstrate that loss.
I really like that. I mean, the wonderful cheaters, right? Like it's so good at when this thing is so good at solving puzzles, right? When there's point A that you have to bridge to point B, like you use the tools that you've got and you find a way to get it done, right? Like I think that's a really
at a higher level
concept.
the athlete is usually the better cheater they are.
That's right.
They're just genetically gifted to be able to find a way that most people can't, or some, maybe it's normal people can't.
And this is the challenge, right? When someone walks into the gym day one, week one, like we don't know what they're coming to us with, right? Like we can ask questions and we can say, and because you hit on it that the best predictor of future injury is past injury, right? But who's to know whether intentionally or otherwise, somebody's going to be fully, truthful and honest about their history. Who knows? And so that's where I think it's really critical. You guys point out thinking about, these positional prerequisites, right? And then do you have the ability to coordinate moving between these positions, right? To make the patterns, ultimately so that you can go out and you can express these things. And I think one thing that's really important is that we tend to think about what happens in the gym as specific to what happens in the gym, right? That movement is movement and influenced by movement. But of course, we know that when I show up to the gym, I'm not just showing up as Tristan, right? Like I'm showing up as Tristan with baggage from traffic and from poor sleep and from poor nutrition and from all these other sorts of things. And so, Amanda, I want to come over to you and thinking with Brent and Omi about movement quality, right? Like in some of the prerequisites here. From a nutritional perspective, what are things that you're going to be looking for that might not necessarily specifically be red flags to injury? I don't know, there may be, and certainly want to explore that, but just red flags generally from nutrition. What when someone walks in day one, week one, what are you trying to get at and figure out with them?
Well, there's a handful of things, but I think the most important thing to talk about right now is just the whole concept. So what we're thinking about from a functional physiological standpoint is that I want to make sure that there isn't anything nutritionally that's going to be holding an athlete back. And so when Brent decides to start putting load on this athlete, under Omi's guidance in a movement quality aspect, is that athlete's body going to be able to recover efficiently and effectively? And so when an athlete comes in, we want to start to understand some of those underlying deficits that they may have that no one really sees. And so, we're talking about what's their nutrient status? Do they have any nutrient deficiencies? What are their inflammatory markers? Are they in a state of inflammation that we can start to quench? How about just omega-3 fatty acid status? Like, we know that certain nutrients are really going to play a role in managing chronic inflammation that is eventually going to occur. And so I think, identifying, what an athlete is working with from a nutrient standpoint is super important when we think about longevity and injury prevention. Another piece that's also very important is, like, you're only as good as what you can absorb. And so your nutrient status is oftentimes actually represented of your gut performance. And so it's almost like the movement quality assessment that Omi is talking about for the body. Your kind of nutrient assessment beyond just what the markers are in your blood is how well your gut is performing. And so you can keep loading on nutrients all day long, but if the gut and the gut bacteria are out of balance, you're not going to absorb in an efficient way, and you're not going to be able to manage inflammation in an effective way. And so, evaluating the gut is also very, very important. The third thing that, is really interesting and emerging is thinking about anthropometrics differently. And so, like, as the dietitian and the nutrition team, it's like, hey, let's see what the guys or the gals, body composition is. Fat ratio to muscle mass, how much weight can we get from the weight to power ratio, et cetera. Well, I think we're missing a fundamental question that we're starting to talk with some leaders on around how much mass can this athlete actually carry on his frame. And so just because a coach wants the athlete to be at a certain weight, or the athlete has in their mind that they should be at a certain level of muscle mass, what can their frame carry? And I think that is a very interesting emerging area of research. So all said and done, hey, let's look at the nutrient status of the athlete. Let's take a look and see if their gut's performing. How much mass can this athlete actually carry? And then we can start the nutrition coaching from there. But really making it and framing it around getting the body in a nutrient state that they can handle and recover the load that Brent and Omi are going to prescribe.
And I think what's so good about that, what's so interesting about that to me, Amanda, is and you even said something to the effect of, you don't know what you're getting, right? Like, and from a nutrition perspective, that's exactly the same, to how Brent would approach an initial sort of movement assessment, how Omi might look at, throwing somebody up on the table, that really we're all trying to do the same thing. And that is color in, who is this person, right? Like, what are your habits? What is your current status, right? Like, and I think with nutrition, we can put exercise into somebody, and I think it's relatively predictable the way that people are going to respond based on our understanding of physiology. This whole thing, I love, and I'm really interested in what you're talking about with the gut biome, right? Like, and your ability to absorb, what you're putting into your body into the first place, because it sounds like what you're saying is that if your gut's not in the right place, it doesn't matter what sort of supplements, what sort of stuff you're putting in, you're just not going to get your money's worth in terms of benefit and performance.
Yeah, you're not getting the full effect. And so it's like, you kind of think about all these different components. And one of the things that Omi said, I think, is important to consider here too. And that is, like, the higher level the athlete, the better the compensator. And, back in my day as a gymnast, I was a master compensator. I was completely screwed up from a movement pattern standpoint. But I think we could apply a similar train of thought into the nutrition side. It's like, the more determined and the higher the grit level of the athlete, the more they're going to push through and, kind of get over some of the physiological impacts of eating like garbage. And so, but the body doesn't forget that. And at a certain point in a certain period of time, the nutrient deficiencies and your body's inability to recover are going to overpower your will and your physical capability to actually do the work. And so, I think that's where all these disciplines really start to come together. And from a nutrition aspect, we just want to get your body into the best place possible so that it can endure, and then optimize adaptation to perform.
the body may be a wonderful cheater, but it's also a master ledger, right? And it's like everything that we do is a blade of straw that goes on the camel's back. And that at some point, and it doesn't matter, right? Like straw is straw, right? Stress is stress. And it could be that I'm having, food that is pro-inflammatory as opposed to anti-inflammatory. It could be that, we're having too many high-speed reps out on the field, Brent. It could be that, we're lacking T-spine rotation to one side, to be able to feed into the hip, Omi. But like, the body will keep track of all of that, right? Like, and manifest in one way or another. And so when it comes to assessment, right? I think, fundamentally, we believe that we have a responsibility to understand the person that comes through the door, right? Day one, week one, like that, we've got to fill in the gaps of what we don't know about that person specifically so that we can identify what their point A is, think about what their point B is, where it is they're trying to go, and then build a bridge to get there. When we think about building that bridge, right, from a periodization standpoint, from a programmatic standpoint, Brent, coming back to you, thinking about programming, what are basic sort of principles and tenets that we're going to be looking at when it comes to preventing injury, right? To enhancing or encouraging movement quality.
Yeah. So the periodization is going to be, it's massive, right? Programmatically, you have to set athletes up for success across the board. So you're looking at bilateral pushes, bilateral pulls, you have hip hinges, you have knee hinges that all have to take place. And throughout those processes, you have to make sure that you're loading them effectively. You've taken care of any type of issues through a foundational period where asymmetries occur from a movement quality standpoint. So if I'm looking at a single leg RDL on the right side, how does that differ from the left side? Am I getting the same results? Do I have instability in the hip? Does the athlete have any type of torso compensations that they have to get into in order to execute the lift? So, foundationally, I'm trying to clean up the movement as much as I can, right? Once we have that taken care of, then we can effectively start to load. And now as I'm loading, I have to be very intelligent about the load that I'm putting on the athlete and strategically when I'm choosing to sprint the athlete, right? So, you only make the mistake once of inducing loads of micro trauma and then taking an athlete out 24 hours later to go sprint at full speed. They walk in the door and they tell you, I don't want to run. My hamstrings are really sore right now. And so as coaches, we say, okay, we'll warm up really good and we'll see how we feel. Not the greatest situation. So let's make sure that as we look across the week, that we're budgeting the right situations for the athlete to be in. And specifically, whenever we get to big micro trauma moments, your unilateral moments or your eccentric exercises, your Nordic curls and eccentric hamstring exercises and things of that sort, where you're going to get that tissue really inflamed. But you have to sit down. You have to look at the amount of time that you have and then budget your time accordingly so that you can effectively, lead up to a quality peak with that athlete and then taper them back down as they get closer to competition.
Man, you made hay out of that one, because I certainly threw you a big wide question. I realized that as you start to get into it, Brent. But it's so I think so. What I heard you saying is that, and I really like that you're talking about bilateral pulls, right? Bilateral pushes. But then you're also talking about single leg RDLs, right? Like you're also talking about hip hinges. And so it sounds like a lot of what you're saying is that from a programmatic standpoint, or something that we're not trying to pigeonhole ourselves too much in one camp or another, right? But rather be,
right,
as opposed to specializing in one thing, right? Like let's generalize in movements, right? So that involves bilateral, but also unilateral. And then also it sounds like what you're saying is that we need to be ready to adapt on the fly. They come in, coach, my hamstrings don't feel great today. Well, okay, let's warm up and see what happens. Right. And so I think those are two really, I think, critical bullets from thinking weeks to months before the event. Right. And Jamie's got weeks to months before they go and do the thing. Right. Like some basic bedrock take home tangible things that we got to do is make sure that we're exposing to a wide variety of movements. Right. Like, and being ready to adapt on the fly, writing your programs in pencil. Right. Because if the environment is sitting behind a desk, writing the program is very different to having somebody somebody in front of you. And Amanda, I want to think from a nutrition. So I appreciate that, Brent.
Yep.
Amanda, from a nutrition perspective, what are some big sort of some big rocks that we're focusing on? Basic sort of behaviors that most folks are going to benefit from in terms of cleaning up nutrition, right? Some standard kind of good advice that we're thinking about for athletes, specific to supporting performance, right? When it comes to being in the gym and out on the field.
Well, I'll build on what Brent said around instability. And so, from a nutritional aspect, like this far out, it's about creating a stable system. And so there are these core, like, foundational things that athletes should be doing, or that any of us should be doing, quite frankly. But, we want to make sure that we understand our energy needs and that we're getting the energy that we need in the macronutrient ratios that are supporting our goals. And so there's some really interesting literature out there around low energy availability, and even not getting enough carbohydrate and protein, making you more at risk for injury. And so that really comes back to ensuring that you're getting the fuel that you need. And so really making sure that you have that. Number two is, you can get really targeted at addressing some of those nutrient deficiencies that we mentioned earlier. But on a whole, this is where it's like nutrition kind of gets a little boring for me. But the reality is that most people don't do it. Like, people don't eat vegetables, they don't eat fruit, they don't eat whole grains. You just have to do that. And so reminding athletes that this is really important. And now more than ever, you need to ensure that you're nutritionally stable. And so eat more color. Another foundational thing is hydration status. We still do Tinkle Tuesdays, and that's where we measure urine specific gravity of our athletes on Tuesdays. And our veteran athletes tend to be hydrated. Our newer athletes that haven't really been thinking about this kind of proactive nutrition fueling approach tend to be dehydrated. So making sure that you're consistently hydrated is another really important core fundamental for creating this stable system. And then lastly, it's getting into the habit of the right type of performance kind of supplementation around and supportive of the activity that you're doing and the training that you're doing. And that's going to evolve as you periodize. And that's where it's so important, to be hand in hand with Brent and your strength coach, or, with your physical therapist, to understand where the athlete is in the stage of their training or their recovery. But there's no doubt that carbohydrate and protein in the post-workout period to refuel, making sure the athlete's getting enough protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, thinking about anti-inflammatory nutrients like essential fatty acids or even SPMs, thinking about things like tart cherry that, not to make all the pain go away, but to manage some of those more like micro tears, so that the athletes feel that they can actually give a little bit more when they can. So anyways, those are the combo of those nutrition strategies to kind of help with the instability.
So it sounds like really the basic advice is the best advice, right? That you need to have a lot of color on your plate, that you need to be well hydrated, and that you have supplementation to support and manage, to support training, right? And maybe specifically manage inflammation and as as you go through the inflammatory process.
Yeah, and it's matching up with the periodization of the training. I think that's like super important too. But the last thing is that it's just getting athletes to really see this as their nutrition training partner. It's like, we're not here to take away the pizza box. That's not what we're trying to do. We're just hoping that maybe it's, I don't know, lots of color on the pizza box, but we just want people to be thinking about, and athletes, we want to help them prioritize the way they fuel to match their end performance goals.
Rainbow pizza. So everybody should be
rainbow pizza. Yeah, I know. You can imagine Amanda coming down, taking the box. No, I don't want to be that.
But I think what's really good about it is what I've heard is that nutrition can make a good training plan great or a great training plan good, right? It's the stuff behind the scenes that sometimes can easily be, taken for granted or maybe put off to the side, right? But if on your way home from the gym, you're always stopping and getting a milkshake and French fries, you're not going to be getting the best out of your training, are you?
Yeah, no. And that's, you just put all that work in. And so it's you want to complement it with all the right nutrition to get the body more stable. And so having a great relationship, well, between like all of us, it's like strength coach, dietitian, physical therapist. They all should be like hand in hand, like singing Kumbaya for the athlete. Like you should not be programming in a silo. And so I think the magic happens when we're all in tune with that. It is the goals of the athlete. It's the issues that are uncovered by Omi. It's what Brent and the strength coach want to do to create load to help improve the strength and power of the athlete. And then it's the dietitian and the nutrition side, making sure that athlete's body is going to be able to endure and recover. And we can all motivate the athlete along the way to optimize their behaviors to actually make that happen.
I think that's perfect, right? Because like you get into it and like where does anatomy end and physiology begin, right? Where does physiology end and nutrition begin, right? Like at the end of the day, it's just a person, and so whether it's stress from training, or stress from nutrition, whether it's support from training, right, or support from nutrition, right? Like it all ends up netting out. And I think that's really important. Omi, you've had a bit of a break, and I want to call you back in now, right? Yeah. So thinking, moving from the weeks to months in advance of an event, getting into the days to weeks before, right? When we're really thinking about starting to get into preparation for, for the thing that our athlete Jamie's going to be doing, right? Like what are we going to be looking at in terms of managing tissue quality, managing movement quality? What are some specifics that we're looking for in terms of putting the pieces together, right? Like you talked about positional prerequisites, you talked about pattern and coordination. What at a more specific, a more meso scale compared to the macro scale we were talking about before, what is it that you're looking for in terms of like shoulders being able to work with torso and hips in terms of defining movement quality?
Yeah, so what we talked about earlier is just the relationships between the torso, shoulder, and hips. I mean, those are the big rocks. From a lower quarter athlete, like someone that's running, just say, and again, hamstrings is an issue, then we also need to obviously tie in the ankles. But, the shoulder, torso, hips are imperative that they are all working in concert with each other. So by this point, you would assume that some of the barriers have been removed. Some of the painful or non-painful dysfunctions have been removed as well, and that they have this ability to load share and they have a fairly clean movement competency. We just need to now make sure that just final tune-ups, maybe, if you will, they're just kind of hitting those big areas. That's kind of a kind of their process as their warm up as well as their cool down. Like you're just trying to hit those things to make sure. And then again, listening to the tissue kind of healing process or tissue adaptation process of, are they feeling tight? Are they feeling sore from the load? Understanding those variables, especially as we come closer and closer to the event, because it's kind of the sweet spot that we have to find, where we still obviously want them to adapt, but we also can't be pushing them beyond their capabilities at this point. And we have to start winding down as their event is coming to play.
So it sounds like you're thinking about managing tissue quality, managing sort of the stress that you're putting on the body. What sort of like from a recovery perspective, somebody has a hard day in the gym, somebody that has a hard training run. What sort of things are you going to be looking for in terms of putting the pieces back together, or at least aiming that stress in a positive direction as best we can?
Yeah, I mean, after the work has been done, I mean, again, scanning that area as an assessment, you should have a method for that. And again, it could be just your own self-management or self-assessment through some sort of soft tissue strategies. Obviously, your recovery and your nutrition, your hydration, your sleep. I mean, all of those things, of course, will go into it. But athletes should have an idea at this point of how they're feeling, how they're moving. And hopefully they're honest with that, but they have a system for themselves to assess these major areas. So we typically put this into our programming so they do have that chance, and we give them the opportunity to spend a little bit more time managing some of their tissue. Again, probably more at a mechanical level here, but just so they are aware of these issues, because we don't want things creeping up on them. We don't want any surprises, but they're in charge of their own bodies. We need bring that awareness and ownership to them to and again give them these strategies. So if they are feeling a little bit beat down, then we have to make adjustments to our program. We have to make adjustments to their prescription. So yeah.
It being able, again, writing your programs in pencil, right? Understanding that the way that we think a program is going to be received is not necessarily the way that it's actually going to be felt, right? And so, Brent, thinking about managing tissue quality, thinking about throwing in the ability to support recovery. What are some specific strategies, right? Like we think about compression, we think about soft tissue, we think about stretching and mobility type activities. Where does that stuff fit? Where does that stuff show up in the program?
Yeah, so there's specific times that ought to be dedicated to that, right? So during the week, where are the strategic points where your soft tissue work goes, where you can, you can get on a high price foam roller and you can take care of your posterior chain. You can take care of your back. You can take care of your feet. You go from that into, some of your active isolated stretching. You finish that and you can go put on some Normatec boots and get some compression relief, or you go get in the hot tub, cold tub, or you go for a swim. That's got to come in strategically once or twice a week, specifically as you're getting closer to competition. One of the things that I've always loved doing is when we arrive at our training site, wherever our competition is going to happen, when we get there, I love putting athletes in a pool. If I can get to a hotel swimming pool, they've just gotten off of a plane. So if we can get them to move around in a low impact situation where body weight is unloaded and, like something like water is so healing anyhow, nobody gets upset when they have to get into the swimming pool after a flight, so being able to put them in a situation where it's lighthearted, it's not monotonous. It's something that's uncommon, so we can get them, into that type of situation where we love to have like trivia times and jokes and telling stories in the middle of a training session that's taking place in a shallow pool or something of that sort, and to be able to refresh the athlete mentally as well. Those are things that can be built into every week that an athlete is training. And as we get closer and closer to competition and we start to unload the athlete, they become more prevalent. And you can never, I'm not going to try and take any words out of Amanda's mouth, but nutrition is paramount when it comes to that point. As we're unloading and strategically being able to manage that process, I tell my athletes all the time, you can only work as hard as you can recover, and you can only recover as well as you can eat. So if you're going to eat poorly, our recovery is going to be bad. And when that happens, we can't train that hard. You won't heal fast enough in order to really get all the horsepower that you need. So it's critical. Those regeneration days, those recovery days, they got to be spaced in there. They got to be plugged in, and they have to be held sacred.
Because it's the classic sort of work plus rest equals success, right? Like it's not work plus work that equals success, and it's definitely not rest plus rest, because if it was, I would be the best athlete on the planet, right? Like it's finding the balance of how much work is enough and how do we actively rest, right? Like how do we support that process as best as possible to really rebound, right? And slingshot up out of the hole. And Amanda, Brent plugged you. So I'm really curious to know what you have to say about supporting recovery from a nutrition perspective. You talked about periodizing and supplementation, but from a recovery perspective, it's thinking in the days to weeks before an event. What are some big things that you're going to be looking at from a nutrition perspective? Is it still as simple as, what sort of color do you have on your plate? What's your hydration and tweaking supplementation, or what are you thinking about?
Well, I mean, I think it's like continuing to fine tune that. And so just as, Brent might be tapering or things are becoming much more specific and pointed from a training aspect, it's the same thing from a nutritional side. So yes, the foundational things, they don't go away, but now more than ever, it's like, let's make sure our hormonal status is in balance and that we have the nutrients our body needs to continue to recover. And so being even more religious around post-training nutrition, having enough protein, the right blend of carbohydrate, but also potentially, tapering that carbohydrate if the intensity and the load is going down. And so it's about being very thoughtful and strategic with that, with the amount of protein and carbohydrate. I think continuing to manage the inflammatory process, like continuing on with that it becomes even more fine-tuned. And then I think, it's bringing attention to maybe some other types of nutrients. I mean, from a performance aspect is one thing, but, collagen and tissue quality are also very important. They've been under a lot of stress and strain as, we start to approach and get closer to said event. And so this is, where the magic of nutrition starts to happen as well. And so it's like, if you have the right blend of gut bacteria, you got things settled there, vitamin C, zinc, copper, all these things help with our body's natural ability to produce collagen. And so, even supplementing with some additional collagen at that point with additional vitamin C, continues to kind of buffer that out. And so, so I guess to answer the question directly, like, is there something else? I think there are a few other things like the collagen that you could start to include here, but it's just becoming really laser focused and making sure that the nutrition isn't slipping, and it's becoming even more pointed to what that ultimate performance event is going to be.
Yeah, it absolutely, and I think it's so interesting. I don't know. I hadn't really thought very much about periodizing the nutrition strategy, and so I think it's really interesting you talk about tapering your carbohydrate as you potentially taper the load that you're working on. Are you when you talk about that specifically, like maybe are you thinking about like what shows up in a post-workout shake, that you go from like a 4-to-1 carb to protein ratio to a 3-to-1 carb to protein, or what might that look like to support recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can think about it in that, that very acute, like post-workout nutrition period. And there's a couple schools of thought. I mean, we want to make sure that the athlete is going to enter the event with full fuel stores. And we want to make sure that they're entering the event adapted to the highest potential. And so, you should always be thinking about the periodization of your nutrition and your training. And so, yes, like if you're looking at, hey, maybe we're doing like 0.4 grams of protein per kilo of lean body mass as like the staple in the post-workout nutrition, 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 ratios of carbohydrate that match the training that's like has just happened, but also has an eye to the future about like what's coming up next. And so that's where nutrition kind of lives in this, like in almost like a couple different dimensions. It's like, what are we doing for the now? And how are we also utilizing our nutrition to prepare for what's next? And so as we think about periodization, that's the approach that you have. And again, to reiterate why the relationship between the strength coach and the dietitian is so important and is so much more than just like calories and body composition.
You're never going to out-train a bad diet, are you?
No, you can't out-train it, but like, I mean, there's nothing better. We all know what it feels like to show up like at a training session, or, maybe back in our glory days, like showing up on the pitch and like you feel good and you're prepared and your body is fueled and you like feel like you're ready to go. And so I think when we say you can't out-train a bad diet, it's like nothing feels better than feeling good and ready. And that's what a great nutrition strategy does.
It seems like it has opportunity to move the needle either to the plus or the minus, right? Like that if you're deliberate and you're diligent and you're periodized in the way that you think about your nutrition to support your performance and your recovery, it can be massively additive, right? So that you show up on the day and you are ready to go. But as good as it can be, it seems like it also has the opportunity to turn it around to the other side and pull away.
For sure. I mean, and I also think nutrition is its own kind of like discipline of science, but it is performance tactic. It is a way to optimize performance, and it is also a recovery tactic. And so, Brent mentioned getting on the, the Hypervolt or getting on the Viper from Hyperice to like work on posterior chain. Like that's a certain modality and a tool. And from a nutrition aspect, it also is a modality and a tool that can be used to get ready. It can be used to recover. And so I like to think about it as just another one of the many tools that we're deploying for the high performance outcomes of the athlete.
At the end of the day, Brent, you and Brent are working with the same person, right? Like, and so yeah. What you do with nutrition is going to affect what Brent's going to be able to do in the gym and vice versa, right? Like and it's so easy to forget that, isn't it? Right? That because we are different people with different experiences, different expertise. It feels very siloed, but it's anything but, isn't it? I think that's such a critical idea, Brent. I do want to come back and touch a little bit on readiness here, because when I talk about building and supporting tissue quality and recovery in training, right? Like thinking in like the mesocycle sort of level, the days to weeks before, like the specific sort of exercise, that sort of thing. You mentioned the places for soft tissue to show up, for stretching to show up, for compression to show up, how important it is to have those 1 to 2 days of active recovery, regen days built into the training week. But I sort of feel like that's a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole puzzle, right? Like, and so when we think about, Omi, you talked about that the body is in a position, injury happens when the body is in a position that it's unfamiliar with, right? Like, and thinking about overstretching the tissue. Well, are there things that we can do from a programmatic standpoint? It talked at the larger scale about having balance of bilateral and unilateral, pushing and pulling. When it comes to maybe a bit of a smaller scale, are there things that we need to be focusing on from a performance perspective to mitigate exposure to injury? Thinking about like elasticity, like where do plyometrics fit into this, right? Like where do more kind of power-based methods fit into it? Think about like kettlebell swings, right? And how that can dial in sort of the eccentric loading capacity, to give back to the posterior chain. What sort of things are you going to be thinking about from an exercise sort of perspective, approaching an event to really prepare for performance at the top end?
Right. So the name of the game is horsepower, right? So you have to be able to move a lot of weight as fast as possible when it comes down to it. Your body weight as fast as possible through those desired ranges of motion. So, early in the process, we've gone through the foundational programming. We've gone through the heavy loading. We've increased kind of the size of the engine, if you will. And then as we get closer to competition, we have to start dialing back the resistance, dialing back the load a bit, increasing the speed that has to get accomplished through that range of motion. Sometimes that is with, heavy but fast movements. And then as we get close, those movements become lighter and obviously faster. And then what does it look like unweighted, right? So you're talking about plyometrics, you're talking about sprinting at full speed drills, your sprint drills that go in there. If it's like a high heel drill where you're focused on recovery, or straight leg bound, fast leg drills where you're going through cycles on that unilateral side repeatedly. Those are excellent moments where you're getting like that same mechanism of injury in like a sprint situation of having to extend the knee very fast right before it hits the ground, and how the body is doing that, how it's accomplishing that. So we can rehearse that over and over and over again. We can take all of the small nuances to the position of the torso and where the hips are and length, and what's the ankle doing on the back side and the front side, and where's the foot contacting the ground inside of each one of those drills. All of that's important in order to repeat that cycle. So as Omi was saying, things like, the injury is happening from uncoordinated movement, neuromuscularly, not knowing where the foot's going to be or the leg's going to be, or how the timing of that's going to happen and what the firing pattern of that muscular system is going to be in order to decelerate the knee and extension. We need to have accomplished all of that. So being able to time that up through those types of drills, all of the plyometrics that come into effect, right? And so that works all symphonically. That works as a concert. So, as we're moving through into our speed strength programming and we're starting to taper out and get ready for competition, obviously the load goes down, the speed goes up, and the athlete is as prepared as possible when it's time to sprint.
So an idea that just came to mind, it's almost like an inoculation, right? Like, and that's something that I think I heard Dan Pfaff say, the sprint and jump coach. He says that sprinters take their sprinting inoculation, right? Because it's a controlled exposure to the dose of the thing that could end up to the mechanism that could potentially hurt you, right? Like, and so by it sounds like, Brent, what you're saying is building a balanced exposure across the force velocity curve, sometimes lifting heavy things slow and other times lifting light things fast and everything in between. You're preparing the body by exposing it to those different force outputs in different time frames, right? Like, and in that way, sort of rehearsing the ability to deal with those forces.
Yep. I was talking to a colleague last week, and we used the term broad spectrum exposure, right? So some things, like I mentioned before, are going to be on two legs. Some things are going to be on one leg. Some things are going to be isometric. Some will be eccentric. Some will be concentric. And some will be heavily loaded, and some will be very lightly loaded or body weight loaded. Some will just be moving as quickly as possible, like, seated physio ball dribbles or prone dribbles or something of that sort. There's loads of different ways to accomplish those tasks, and being able to neurally time those up, accelerate and decelerate effectively, and make sure that the athlete is checking all of those boxes is the name of the game.
And I think the thing that comes to mind is that that's a lot of stuff, right? That's a lot of things, to have plyometrics and to have movement skills and to have strength-based strength movements, power-based strength movements, speed strength-based strength movements, right? Like, and you need, like, it feels like initially you're going to need 3 to 4 hours, right? 5-6 days a week to be able to get into it. When we get into actually programming this stuff, like, how long are you spending on plyometrics? How long are you spending in a 75, 90-minute training session?
Mm-hmm.
How long are you spending on like plyometrics and med ball, for example? Like, how many movements are you programming?
High value and short minutes. So I had sessions today that I coached, and our plyometric session was 10 minutes in length. And that's probably a lengthy plyometric session. Because I'm looking to get 35 to 40 contacts inside of a movement-based session. We had an acceleration session today, so how can I expose the athlete to those high elements of that plyometric load in every direction that I need to as quickly as possible, and then move on to the next segment. We always kind of talk about the coach. If you think about like a music producer, right? They sit at that big table outside the studio, and they have all the knobs and all the switches and all the lights and all the sliding bars in order to create the exact sound that they want. And so that's what I think of a coach like. The more you are schooled up as a strength and speed coach, then the more knobs and the more slides you get. And then the more you get to talk to people like Omi and sit and listen to him, you get a whole nother compartment that pops open over here where you can create some more sounds with that. You talk to Amanda, and now you have a whole other section of knobs and switches, and being able to turn each of those for each athlete that you have effectively is the important piece, knowing how they all work together, right? So I have a blanketed program that takes everybody through everything that needs to check the box. But athlete A might need more plyometrics than athlete B does. And athlete C might need to load heavier than athlete D does because they have a strength deficit. Or, if I have an asymmetry on athlete E, then I need to address that. So, we're constantly changing all of the sounds that are coming out of our board over here in order to create the best result possible inside of the group scenario.
And that's just it, isn't it? Right? Like, it's one program that if you have 12 athletes, right? Like you said, if you have 12 athletes on one program, it's not 12 people doing the same thing, right?
That's right.
Like, it's 12 people doing the version of the thing that they need, right? And it could be as simple as adding or subtracting a few reps here or a few reps there. I think the piece that's really critical, I think, from a programming perspective, like we talked about. It's the same person, that shows up with Amanda is the same person that shows up with you, right? Like, and so nutrition is going to affect performance, and performance is going to affect nutrition. Well, you might only have 10 minutes of a plyos program, and that might be an extended block of plyometrics.
Mm-hmm.
But what you said after that, I think, was critical in that it was an acceleration day, right? So, like, the stuff that you do in plyometrics is going to be aimed specifically at being able to put you in a positions to be able to make the patterns, to express the movement of acceleration, but you're going to get more quote unquote plyometric sort of reps when you're doing sprint work, aren't you? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, just because a movement isn't called plyometrics doesn't mean it's not plyometric in nature.
Right?
So, like,
right.
even though you're only getting 30 reps, right, 30 contacts in your plyos program, you could be much closer to 100, 150, 200 on any given day, right? Which is where I think a lot of research shows up in terms of the efficacy of programming plyometrics programs, right? Like, so it's about it. I love what you said before about having high value, right? Like in those movements, that it's very targeted and it's very specific, right? So that because it's not just about the way that you recover to support tissue quality. It's about putting the tissue in the position to be able to adapt and withstand to the loads that are placed upon it, right? Like, and it's about your center of mass being over your base of support from a movement quality standpoint, It's about your hamstrings being able to eccentrically load, to isometrically control, to concentrically give back, because you've supported them properly, right? With proper anti-inflammatory nutrition strategies, that you've hydrated appropriately, right? That you've periodized your nutrition to support the periodizing that you do in your training plans. And so thinking then on the day of, right? Coming to the day of competition and the minutes to hours before an event. Amanda, I want to come to you. What does Jamie need to be focusing on in terms of setting himself up in a position to be able to perform, right? Like you talked about how good it feels to show up and feel ready, right? Like, and granted, a lot of that is going to happen in the weeks to months and the days to weeks before competition day. But morning of, what are things that we need to focus on in terms of showing up at the start line ready to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this stage in the game, like, you are just really topping things off. And so, I mean, like I said before, like, energy availability and an issue with energy availability in a macro sense puts you at a higher risk for injury. But like, when we think about the day of performance, it also puts you at a higher risk for not being able to perform. And so I think it's just really pinpointing that strategy. And I mean, I hate to be vague, but it's like, if you're a track and field athlete and you're going to sprint, like, that's like one thing. If you are a soccer player and you're going to be on the pitch for 90 minutes, that means something else. If you're going to play, if you're an NFL player and you play a lot of minutes, like, that means something else than someone who is not going to play as much. And so I think, again, it's the same concept. And so day of, you want to make sure that you're going to have enough carbohydrate, you're going to have enough fuel in the tank to support where your car needs to go. And so making sure that strategy is nails. You want to make sure that your body is hydrated going into that activity. And so, like, I think those are just like two fundamental concepts that when it's time to shine and the lights go on, you want to have enough fuel in the tank, and you want to make sure that your hydration status is good to go. And then hopefully the rest of it takes care of itself, right? Your training, your muscles have been adapted. They're as strong and powerful as they could be. You've got enough nutrients available to continue to support energy metabolism. Like, you have all of that. And so anyways, the last minute top off is enough fuel to get your car where it needs to go, meeting your body, and that you're hydrated along the way.
You have a plan and you stick to the plan, right? Like nothing new on game day, right?
Nothing new on game day, and that you have a plan. It's like, I mean, you know how many gallons of gas go in your car. And so, like, you're not going to like fill up a quarter of a tank before you drive across the desert from Phoenix to San Diego. Like, I mean, you're not going to do that. You're going to fill the whole thing up. But I know how far I'm driving.
Right.
So this is where, like, working with your coaches and working with, strength coaches, ATCs, position coaches, to understand, where am I going? Like, how far am I going? And then your dietitian to kind of create that strategy to make sure that you actually have enough fuel to get there. So you can perform your skill.
And then thinking about getting ready to perform, Omi, you talked about positional prerequisites, right? And then coordinating through patterns, so that you're able to do the things that you have to do, right? Like, so from a Omi, I want to come to you for warm up, and then Brent, I want to come to you thinking about sort of the athlete mindset on competition morning, right? But like, Omi, what are we looking for in terms of reinforcing positional prerequisites, coordinating patterns, and then being able to do the thing you need to do?
Yeah, and if it's the day of, it's minutes before. I mean, this is your pre-flight checklist. You know what you need to do. You should have a routine to be able to scan your body, get those big rocks ready, rehearse some of these movements, because you know what demands are coming for that day. And again, by this point, it's nothing new. There's no surprises. So you should be rehearsing those patterns, and you should be ready to go at this point. Like, there's nothing new. There's nothing different you're going to do. You've led up to this. You knew if the preparation was solid, you knew the demands that were going to come. You added the movement variability. You did some of these pre-programmed pieces to these random or reactive pieces. So, like, there should be no surprises at this point. So you go through your pre-flight checklist, you hit your big rocks, you start rehearsing some of your movements, you're making sure that you're ready. And again, if there's any adaptation or adjustments we need to make last minute, if you are feeling a little off, then we make those adjustments. But for the most part, it should be pretty routine at this point.
to have a plan, stick to the plan, right? Like that soft tissue mobility, stability, structure through pillar prep, and have a consistent routine, through your movement prep routine, and do the things that you know that you need to do, right? The pre-flight checklist, right? Because Brent, what is on competition morning, right? Like what's going to be going through Jamie's mind, right? As they're getting ready to go and compete. And what are some situations maybe that you've encountered, and how do you sort of help? I'll give this example. I had a sports psych professor at university who said it's not about making the butterflies go away. It's about having them fly in formation. Right. So as coach, how do you organize the butterflies?
Yeah, no, that's a really good one. We talk a lot about going into high stress situations, and you step out there, you run through the tunnel or whatever the case is, and the heart rate is pumping, right? So never before have you run 30 yards and all of a sudden you can't breathe, and it's not because you're out of shape. And everybody thinks I'm not conditioned. No, you're absolutely conditioned. But that's your body, reacting to the situation. And when we have those moments, I always tell our athletes that I'm working with it. Those are the times that you embrace that, right? That's your body activating your heart in order to pump more blood so that you have more oxygen, which is why it's beating fast, because it's ready for competition. Like take a deep breath and enjoy that. Or if you feel like you're anxious, it's just because you're super alert. Use that alertness in order to process faster and be where you're supposed to be and read the play before it happens, and when we get down to competition, the athlete shouldn't be thinking about physically, where am I? They should be thinking about winning. And so I am always just encouraging that as much as possible. We talked about already being automatic. And when a curveball gets thrown at you in competition, roll with it and be creative and go be a beast, and so those type of situations are where greatness really comes out, where it's like, it doesn't matter the situation that you put me in, I'm going to beat you. And I think that's just part of being a competitor. And the more that we tend to confound the athlete with how are you feeling, or let's do this and let's do that, and let's take care of X, Y, and Z. Sometimes the more that you give them layers to process. So if those things need to happen, I'm one that tries to take care of those behind the scenes and in a very uninvasive manner, where it almost feels like the sport or it feels like practice, but it ties it back to the game for the athlete, versus drawing attention to, if I'm sore in a hip flexor before I have to go compete, drawing loads of attention to that. But kicking them straight over to Omi for a hot second and say, hey, can you give them a quick stretch out over here? Because we've got to get mobile and really fluid before we go out and sprint or whatever the case is. But, at the end of the day, they got to go out and compete. So making sure that they're comfortable, confident, and ready to rock and roll is the name of the game.
Yeah, I think that's really good, right? Like sort of reframing that, like, yes, your heart rate is smashing, right? Like because it's your body getting ready, right? So like, I love that you said to enjoy that, it coming from having a bit of history in the endurance community, it like the thought that I have in the endurance community is that if you can survive the training that you do to get to the start line, the race is a celebration, right? Like you've done the work. You've put in the time, you've put in the effort, right? So enjoy the day.
Right.
If you're an athlete competing in front of people, in a field-based team sport, if you're in endurance, right? Enjoy the sufferfest, right? Enjoy the pain cave of putting yourself through that competitive sort of piece, because you've put in the work at that point, right? Like, so I really appreciate the conversation here, right? And to have a bit of a recap, we think from a programmatic standpoint, from a macro scale, in terms of managing or preventing possibility that Jamie's going to pop their hamstring. You think about building balance into the training plan, right? Having a balance of pushing and pulling, having a balance of bilateral and unilateral. Amanda, you talked about having a balance of color across the plate, right? So that you are broadly sort of getting all of the benefits of that you can be getting out of fruits and veggies. Having a good hydration strategy and supplementation strategy to match what's happening in the gym. Then in the training plan, the more meso sort of scale of the days to weeks before, we're talking about supporting recovery, right? So Brent, you talked about strategies on regen days of, the soft tissue pieces, the mobility pieces, the compression pieces, but also having a broad exposure to points along force velocity curves. Sometimes you lift heavy things slowly, and sometimes you lift light things quickly, and all points in between. Amanda, you talked about managing inflammation and doing what you can to support recovery, thinking about things like omega-3s and collagen intake to put yourself in a position to really rebound through the process of muscle protein synthesis after breakdown. And then on the day of, I love that there was this sort of this coalescence around the idea of have a plan and stick to the plan, right? That you've done the things. So don't go ahead and start changing it on the day of, because nothing's good going to come from it, right? Like, we thrive as animals. We thrive in environments which are consistent, right? So be consistent on game day, because the butterflies are going to happen, right? So enjoy it, right? Like, take advantage of those sorts of opportunities. I really appreciate the conversation, you guys. I really enjoyed this. I hope the folks at home did as well. Any final thoughts, you guys, as we go around the horn? Omi, why don't we start kick over to you?
No final thoughts. I mean, I think it is, the magic is the coordination between, well, I said no final thoughts and I'm talking, but the magic is the coordination between these three entities, that we represent, of performance, physical therapy and nutrition. I mean, that is the magic. We're all working towards one common goal. We all understand each other's realms enough to understand where we're going and where we're going together, and knowing when to pull in, each other. So I think that is the magic.
Absolutely. Amanda?
I mean, you just do all this to unleash your inner beast. I mean, I love that, Brent. That's really great. But I think you have to have a lot of fun doing it as well. And so, I appreciate my relationships with Omi and Brent. And I think, as individual practitioners in the field, sometimes we get kind of really siloed and sometimes a little territorial. And you really can't serve the athlete in a way that the athlete needs to be that beast without great relationships around you. So nutritional stuff aside, that science, you can apply that to an athlete, but creating relationships with other practitioners to serve the athlete, I think is the real takeaway.
And there's so much good there, Amanda. And Brent, final words, final thoughts?
Yeah. We all as practitioners, we spend so much time learning and acting and coaching and treating and consulting. And at the end of the day, the athlete needs to go play their sport, right? So the best ability is availability. So, when it comes down to that, we have to make sure that we're preparing the athlete for the sport as much as possible. And I think that sometimes people inside of our industry can get, really in love with either how strong they can make somebody or how fast they can make somebody. And sometimes they feel like their silo is more important than somebody else's silo. But I can tell you, there's never been a time where, somebody in our sports med department or a physical therapist or an ATC has come up and given me a bit of advice on an athlete or told me to back off. That has to change my plan. It absolutely has to change my plan. I can't dismiss that information and say we're going to crank forward, because there is no rep that day that's worth an injury. So the same thing comes from the nutrition side, right? If there's an athlete that is not presenting right from a hydration standpoint, then that athlete's got to be pulled out of my session. It's got to be made to go fuel effectively, and then come back and then we can get going after they've been given the green light. But I think that, just to close that big old long random thought, the more that we can kind of downplay our own importance and realize that we're there to service the athlete and get them ready to compete, the better. So
that's so good, right? Because I understand things the way that I understand things. Amanda, you understand things the way you understand things. Omi, the same to you, and Brent, same to you. And when the thing that we're talking about is one person, I have to consider, the things that you guys understand, because it might be slightly different than what I do, right? Like, in your experience is different than mine. And, the secret ingredient in any program is love, right? And your love is different than my love, and that's okay, right? And when we find each other as resources, then that's who ends up benefiting in that situation is the athlete, right? Like, and if we're here to serve the athlete and we feel a responsibility to that person as they show up in front of us to help them do the thing that they want to do, that just benefits everybody in the end. Well, you guys, I really enjoyed this. I appreciate your time. I hope everybody did at home. Stay tuned for more information, for more panels coming from this Exos Education membership. Thanks so much, you guys.